I really wish I could tell you this simple cutting board is really easy to make and you can do it really quick with minimal amount of tools. Except that would just be a straight out lie. In fact, I took a class to build this actual cutting board, an expensive class by a professional to show me how to do it. And I learned a lot of things, but to be honest, I don't think I could repeat this process without a lot of trial and error. So, yeah. But instead, I'm sure most of you have seen bamboo cutting boards. These right here are easily found in most stores. You can find them online, just about any online store. But, I mean, that right there is no comparison. You got something really cool looking and something quite plain. So, how about we do some simple techniques with this bamboo cutting board and make it look, okay, yeah, no, it won't look that cool. But we can definitely spruce this up where most people look at it and go, wow, did you make that? Let's do this. When you're looking for your cutting board, try to get one that is close to a square or a rectangle. You want something that has close to 90-degree sides. These are slightly curved, but I believe I can work with this. If you find something that's round or has a bunch of different shapes to it, I would avoid that for your first one. Now it's time to start cutting on our boards, and to do that, if you have one, I'd recommend using a bandsaw. This is a large model. Maybe you have a smaller model, little benchtop version. I'd use that. If you have one, just remember it will cut slower than this. But let's say you have neither one of those. You don't have a bandsaw at all. You could probably do this with a jigsaw. So I'm actually going to use a jigsaw for this process to make it easy for you, but if you have a bandsaw, use it first. Something to remember when we're making our cuts is that we can't make any 90-degree angles going across our board. That's just too hard for our saws. So when we're doing this, we need to make kind of a nice flowing angle, almost like a little wave going across the board, or maybe just a nice little curve. That would work great. So I definitely take a pencil or something similar and just kind of start drawing something out here just to see what everything starts to look like, because that way you can go back and erase it before you start to cut. When we're drawing our line, we have to remember to go in basically the same direction as the grain of the board. For example, this one goes side to side, not up and down. So as long as we have our line going basically in that direction, it'll be a nice strong connection when we glue it back together later. Another thing to remember is that our line here is just an estimate. It's just a guide. There's a good chance as we're cutting this out, our tools won't be able to follow it exactly. So in those cases, we just want to get it as close as possible. And finally, only draw one line at a time. So we'll draw one line, do the cut process, do everything we need to do to get it back together. And once that's complete, we'll go back and draw a second line. If you don't do that, everything will be shifted just a little bit and won't look right. For the jigsaw, I'm not going to use your standard blade because if you look at it, it's quite aggressive and I don't believe it's going to make that clean of a cut. But instead, I'm going to use a blade that is considered more of like a scroll saw type of blade. And this should allow everything to be a little bit cleaner and easier to go around the curves. Whenever you're using a jigsaw, usually you just clamp one side down and the other side just falls off, whatever you need removed. But in this case, I can't do that because if this cracks or breaks off on the end prematurely, then it'll just mess up that end. So I have to support this on the opposite side. So I'm going to use a piece of thin plywood to stick under the cutting board here as we're doing our cuts. And that way I can clamp this side down and hopefully this excess piece of plywood here will support this on the end and not let it break off. But of course you don't need that excess piece of plywood if you're using a bandsaw. Just make sure you support both sides of your board as you put it through the blade. As you can see here, the plywood underneath supported this piece and it didn't allow it to fall off. When you're making your cut with your jigsaw, it is very important to have a very smooth, fluid cut all the way along your line here. Because if you don't, you're going to create a little notch or a divot that's very hard to clean up. But if you keep it nice and smooth and without stopping, it should come out to a really cool cut. It's now time to figure out what we're going to put in between these two pieces to really make it stand out. Now we have to remember that bamboo is a very hard material, so we need a hardwood to go in between this. Whatever material we choose, we need to make sure that it stands out against this yellow bamboo. I have padauk, walnut, and maple here, and all three of these should work well because they can be seen really easily against this yellow bamboo. For our first piece, I decided to go with padauk. I cut it down to about 1/16 of an inch, and that should allow me to squeeze these together. And that should work well. To hold everything together, I'm going to use a number 2 glue. It's water resistant and it's one of the more common ones used for cutting boards. I'm going to use some parallel clamps to hold everything together as the glue dries. If you don't have these, that's okay. Just make sure you clamp this together and keep it as flat as possible. I'm also going to use some plastic right here on top of the clamps to keep the glue off of them. I've coated both sides of our strip with some glue. Now we're going to clamp it in place. As we're clamping together, we want to make sure that the outside edges of our cutting board stay nice and even together. Also, we want to push down on this insert, making sure that it is at least level on the bottom. I have it where it sticks up a little bit on the top, but we can trim that down later. At this point, we kind of just have to sit and wait. Now, the instructions say whenever you're using this glue to give it at least 30 minutes with the clamps. Now, considering we are creating a lot of stress with those curves and those bends that are definitely going to want to spring back straight, I'd actually give this several hours to dry. While you're waiting, now is a good idea to go ahead and plan out your next curves and cuts you plan on making in the cutting board. Also, go ahead and cut out some strips of wood. That way you can kind of mix and match the colors, figure out exactly where you want them to be on your cutting board. While we're still waiting for that glue to dry, I was wondering, instead of a bandsaw or a jigsaw, could we use maybe a table saw or a miter saw to give this some nice accents and look really cool? Let's give it a shot. Over here at my miter saw, it has a nice fence along the back. But unfortunately, this cutting board is curved. So if I was to try and make this cut on this miter saw, I have a feeling it would move around, making this a very unsafe cut. So I think I'm going to try this over at the table saw. But if by chance your board is nice and flat on the end out here, this would be a lot safer of a cut. I'm going to make this cut on this table saw sled. That'll allow me to brace it really carefully and make it safely. I would not recommend using it on your fence because, again, this is curved and that would make it a very unsafe cut. And as you can tell, I did it with an offset because I think that'll just look the best. One of the best parts about using a table saw is that our pieces are perfectly straight. We don't have to worry about having wood that reaches around those curves. So therefore, we can make our inserts as thick as we want. Well, to a point. In my case, since I do have a curve, I can't make them too thick or they will look a little off. But if by chance you have a squared off board, make them as thick as you want. Here's the killer combination I came up for this board. It is walnut, maple, padauk, maple, walnut. And I'm going to glue all this together in one big piece so that it'll allow me to trim all this unevenness off the back first, making it a lot easier later. And if you do this, make sure to use plenty of clamps so you have equal pressure going all the way across your wood. It's now been a few hours, so let's take a look at our glue ups and see how well we've done. Here's the original or first cutting board that we worked on. And here's the cut that I did, and I had some excess time, so I went back and made a secondary cut. At this point, we have some high edges we have to get rid of before we can make any additional cuts, otherwise it'll interfere with the jigsaw. And to do that, you can use a little hand plane, or maybe even a hand sander. All we're trying to do is remove these high edges without removing any additional parts of the board. So you can just go really carefully, try and remove those. As you can see here, little pieces are coming off. We want that to be as flush as possible so it doesn't interfere with any additional cuts that we make. And when it comes to the table saw version, I use the saw and some sanding to get this almost perfectly smooth. And that way I can get everything lined up and glued together. Now whether you're doing the jigsaw version or the table saw version, in any case, making sure everything is nice and smooth and removing all these tabs on the end is very important because we want our hands to kind of run across it and it just feel like it was supposed to be there. That way it looks good and feels good to the touch. Now to give you an idea what this looks like when it's finished, this was kind of my test version to see if this concept would even work. If you notice, these lines are all intersecting. It's really easy to do whether you're at the bandsaw or the jigsaw. Once everything is flush, just cut over each of these and it looks really cool seeing how they all intersect. One thing I do want to note on this finished product is that the outer edge, there is a very slight bump to it going over these additional pieces of wood that I've inserted. Now that could be because it needs maybe a little more sanding, or it could be just because of the different densities of wood and the way they expand and contract. But there is a slight bump there, so just keep in mind that might happen. But this front face here, that feels really nice and I think it looks really cool. What do you think? Now whether you want some curved lines, some really cool intersecting lines, or just an accent that runs through your board, this is a really easy way to do it. Just remember, it does take time because you have to let all the glue to dry. That's really the hardest part of this, is the waiting process. But overall, I think you should give this a shot, so get out in your shop and have fun building.